Hi, welcome to Magic is Real. I'm Shannon Torrance. I'm your host. I'm a psychic medium. I'm a human. And today I have with me Adam Tapp. Adam is a paramedic. He is a near-death experiencer, and he hosts a podcast called Tapped into Psychedelics. So we're going to talk about all of it, and I'm very happy to have him here. Adam, thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you for having me, Shannon. This is sounds like a really interesting opportunity to have a really cool conversation. So,
It definitely is, and I'm psyched to have you. So I'd love to start by talking about you and your background and whatever you're comfortable sharing about your childhood, what your spiritual beliefs may have been growing up, who you believed yourself to be or are as a person.
well, those are all interesting things. And so, the easiest low-hanging fruit is I was born and raised in Northern Ontario in the bush, near Sault Ste. Marie, which is probably irrelevant for most people as a geographic location. And I moved to Toronto when I was in grade 9, and my mom was an emergency nurse. And in high school and stuff, I was kind of mostly just getting into trouble. My mom had suggested that I do paramedic, and that was 23 years ago. And I went and did the program and started working in Ontario as a paramedic. And it's been very interesting experience ever since. And now the notion of religious belief structures, I find that a very unique statement because, North America is a theocracy in a sense. It's founded on Christian ideals. You see in God we trust above state buildings in USA. And it's very integral that our belief structure is built around that, even if you're secular or anything, is that subconsciously these ideals are there. And I grew up with my mom's side of the family being Irish Catholic and my dad's side being sort of Protestant. And even within that, there was conflict. He wasn't allowed to the Roman Catholic Mass because he was a heathen or whatever they phrased it as. And I think from a very young age, I just found that Roman Catholicism was riddled with guilt. And oddly enough, I barely remember this, but I think it was for my confirmation or something. I just ran away. I think I packed a bunch of bags full of Cheerios and took my dog and went in the bush for the entire day just to not be there. And my mom was like, if he doesn't want to do it that bad, then he doesn't have to. And so to me, I've always found organized religion to kind of be a geographic lottery in the sense that, if I was born in India, I could be a Jain, I could be Buddhist, I could be Hindu, I could be Sikh, I could be all these different things. And it's just simply the area in which I was born and the cultural influence upon me dictates what religion I was. And so that simple fact alone, based on logic, to me, just sort of made all religions, none of them right, none of them wrong, all of them sort of just trying to point to some sort of universal truth that is just hidden from everyone. And more often than not, they're just metaphorically a way to live, not be an ass. You know what I mean? For the most part, it's just insinuating community and how to exist one another. And let's be realistic, a lot of them are a little bit archaic in their rule structures, and that's fair. But, I've just always found it interesting. So I guess, I think a lot of people go through the atheist stance, but I don't think I've ever really truly been atheist, more just agnostic or deitistic in the sense where I think I've always felt that there was something more. I just didn't attribute a script to it, if I may say that.
You may say that resonates with me very deeply. So you're paramedic in London, Ontario, and what were you doing at that time? I mean, in your life? I know you were a paramedic, but what else was happening in your life at the time of your
When you
NDA?
say, okay,
Yeah, of your NDA, I will
that's good,
specify when
specific.
this thing happened.
Well, I've always done a lot of woodworking. I find it very cathartic. And the interesting thing about being a paramedic is that you start the job and people have a tendency to start quite young. You're in your early 20s and you're seeing these acts of violence, not person to person necessarily, but just a car, people torn apart and everything. And there, at the time, and still to some extent, there isn't really a method in which you deal with this. And someone could tell you 1,000 times the proper way to deal with stress, but in that moment, it's not something that you really have an opportunity to do. And our job is primarily making order out of chaotic situations. So you don't have time to, work through the situation that you're in. And more often than not, you just stuff it down and it's over time it accumulates. And I think that's true with life in general, is that we just accumulate traumas and experiences and just bury them. And And you see it in people you get older, and you see people, the white knuckle in a glass of whiskey, or control freaks, or just even the interesting nuance of personalities of people just carrying all this stuff with them. And, I'd gotten into psychedelics about 10 years ago, maybe. And when I had my near death experience, that was in 2018. So I would actually had quite a few psychedelic experiences up until that point. And even when I started this thing, it was, I don't want to use the word serendipitous, but to some extent, like a friend of mine, he had got basically in a car accident when he was in high school, and it destroyed his hand, like massive reconstructive surgery. And at that time, the answer to everything was Oxycontin. And so the doctor just kept giving him, narcotics, and he got profoundly addicted. And he had tried rehab, numerous different things. And he went and did an Ibogaine ceremony, or whatever you want, facilitation. And Ibogaine is a African psychedelic from the root bark of the iboga tree. And it's like a 14-hour experience. And
Wow.
it's not what I would call pleasant, but real work isn't pleasant. It's grinding, right? Like it's hard. And it completely alleviated his addiction. He's, like he did one in once and has never ever even thought about touching a narcotic since. It changed his life. He's very spiritual now. And he wanted to start giving people this in Canada. And at the time, it wasn't controlled at all. And so I was like, yeah, I can facilitate this or help you, because it can cause a prolonged QT period where the bottom and top part of your heart beat at a slightly more expanded rate, and some liver issues. And so it's helpful to have someone with at least some kind of idea of cardiology. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to do this, I need to try it. And so I went in and had this experience that was just indescribable. And it was hard. Like it was scary. It was difficult. I was like re-experiencing, like I kind of look at it this way, is that I was basically pulling out all of these horrible things I'd seen in my career as a paramedic. And it was almost as if I just in the moment had thrown them wet and dirty into a clothesbin. And this was pulling them out, pulling, like acknowledging them, washing them, folding them, and putting back in a dresser. And, at that time of my life, like I had crippling back pain, like to a point where I was like, I can't even do my job anymore. And I remember the next morning lying there, just in awe of the experience. And I felt all these muscles relaxing in me. I've never had back pain since. And this was like chronic daily back pain, like bent over, couldn't get off the floor, heating pads, and said the works. And to me, it was just internalized stress. We
Yeah, I was
just,
going
I
to
would,
ask you if it's
yeah.
the body keeps the score and it causes the stress and all this, the emotional stuff can actually cause physical manifestations in our body. I mean, I think that's most of why we have these ailments.
I completely agree with you. Another thing too, like people constantly underestimate what stress can do to your body. Like when you think about the amount of cortisol released in your body as secondary and tertiary stress hormones, like being startled and having this sudden release of epinephrine and your, flight or flight response, that's fair. That's a biological necessity. But sitting there and fixating on life and everything just weighing you down causes a very, very different cascade of hormones, which basically cause an inflammation response in your body. And one could argue quite successfully that a multitude of the comorbidities that we experience in society are probably made significantly worse, if not caused by just prolonged stress.
Yeah, I'm a chronic stress sufferer, and my doctor said, I'm surprised you don't have fibromyalgia. What I do have is muscle tension dysphonia, which is affects my voice actually, and it is a mind body syndrome. It's my whole entire life being so sensitive, absorbing everything and so much stress and cortisol. I now have to take Prozac because otherwise, at least, until I find something else that I can I've tried going off, but the thing is that it's caused so many health problems for me, and it's my body's in a state of inflammation, and there's so many things that have happened, and I like that you said most of, if not, if not all, because yeah,
Yeah.
obviously there are genetic stuff like cancer and things that it just runs in families, and so it kind of trickles down. But like you said, the it can make it worse. It makes the symptoms worse, and
Well,
so it's
yeah.
very real.
Yeah, no, I totally think that. And another thing too, when it comes down to like, say someone gets cancer from smoking cigarettes. Did the chronic stress and inflammation through their body increase the chances of getting the cancer, and then
Right.
your immune response. You know what I mean? Like nothing is ever just caused by one thing. Everything is just a multitude of multiple things all contributing, it seems. But
Yeah.
again, that's
It's
yeah.
yeah, I believe that too. And I love that, and I want to talk more about that as well as we go through this story. And so you were woodworking, and what happened?
So interesting is that it's a wood burning device, and it's a microwave transformer from a microwave, and you pull it out, and what it does is that you plug into the wall. It's 120 volts from your wall AC, and it converts it into around 12,000 volts DC. And now I've never really liked them. I don't care for them, but a friend who I was making a table for, he was doing this sort of, he grew up in the Bahamas and he wanted this coral pattern in the table. And I'm like, all right, well, we'll do this. And I was having a conversation with him while we're doing this wood etching, and it was extremely humid out. I remember I was mid conversation, and then it was just, I'm assuming it arced into my hand or something. And it was just like someone flicked a switch. And it just immediately was this incredibly overwhelming power and pain, like pain that I didn't even think was imaginable. It was like every cell in my body was being torn to pieces. And visually, all there was just these cylinders that went up and down, like this iridescent green with hints of orange. And it was like there was no relation to anything else around me, just these cylinders. And it was hard to think, like I couldn't even focus thoughts. I remember I was really trying to like create a thought, and it was that I don't think I'm breathing. I'm being electrocuted. And then I just felt like I was falling for well, like a long time. And as I was falling, I was like just fading. And all of a sudden, I was like waking up in this perfect inky blackness in this place I had always been. And I wasn't Adam. I wasn't alive. I wasn't dead. I wasn't anything. It was just like raw consciousness. And it was, if there was a definition of absolute contentment, this would be it. It was just perfect. And I was just there. There wasn't anything to think about, nothing to fret about or want. It was just perfect. And time seemed very odd to me. Like there was no such thing as time from my perspective. But I sat there for a while, I guess. And I say sat loosely. I had no body. And I just felt this frequency washing over me. And it was like fractals and gasoline on water of rainbow. And it was almost like this juxtaposition of thoughts and feelings and emotions. And I guess one could say it was like it was this overwhelming feeling of this is okay. And I felt myself being sort of pulled or disassembled into everything. And it was like literally just becoming part of the fabric of the universe. And it was perfect. There was no fear. This is what happens. This is what's meant to be. And then I started being electrocuted again. And at the time, it was confusing, but in hindsight, it was me being defibrillated. I got defibrillated twice. And this defibrillation lasts zero point 0.5 seconds for those of us in what we perceive as reality. But this, it felt like it was like 5-10 minutes, if I could even put a time frame to it. And then all of a sudden, now I'm Adam. I'm dead. I know I'm dead. I have like a wife. This is at my, like everything's flooding back, but I'm still in this space of this inky darkness. And I remember being like, oh, I think something got screwed up. And then so I'm there now, and I'm like, for a long time, and it was just coming to terms with myself and what I am. And then all of a sudden I started being electrocuted again. And that was the second time I was defibrillated. And then at some point during the electrocution, I felt myself sort of being pulled or sucked or some variation of that. And then I think I had a vague sense of being back in my body or smelling burnt flesh. And I was in a coma for about 6 or 7 hours or 8 hours or something afterwards in the ICU. And then I just woke up. and it was funny too. Like I knew exactly what happened. Like I woke up, looked around. I'm like, I'm in the ICU. I've been here before, like as a professional, and my family's there. And I remember like I was intubated, so I got extubated. But I remember one of the first things, I'm like, how long has it been? And if someone had said like 25 years, I've been like, yeah, that makes sense. And
Yeah.
it was an awesome experience, to be honest with you.
I'm
Like,
just curious oh, sorry, I wanted to hear what you had to say, but I had a quick question is
no, no, yeah.
how did somebody find you there? How did they know?
So my friend who I was doing this for was in front of me, and he had
Oh,
taken a high voltage safety course like 2 weeks before, which is very convenient because he would have died if he had touched me. And so he took a wooden sawhorse and knocked it out of my hand. And my wife's a cardiac nurse, and so he went and got her. And then she came out, and I was like gray, and it's called guppy breathing. It's basically a respiratory response,
mm,
but nothing's happening. And so she started CPR and called 911, and my coworkers were about a block and a half away.
wow.
Yeah.
That must have
So,
been surreal for them to be working on you.
well, I remember talking to Sean, and this was afterwards, and he was like, "Yeah, they got the call," and he was like, "Oh, Adam lives on that street," and they're getting closer. They're like, "Oh, that's Adam's house," and then
Oh
they're
my
like,
God.
"Oh, it's Adam,"
That's
and
crazy.
yeah, yeah.
Do you remember what you were about to say before I rudely interrupted you?
I was just thinking, like, a lot of people like, "I'm so sorry that happened to you," and I'm like, "I'm not." Like,
Yeah.
it was weirdly validating. You know what I mean? Because to me, I feel like a near-death experience to some extent is an endogenous psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
Like we have DMT or dimethyltryptamine in our bodies. We have 5-methyloxy dimethyltryptamine. We have all these things that get released in our body. And in previous and post experiences on similar substances, it is very uniquely similar. And now it's anything, that is different from what we perceive as reality is profoundly different. But it's just, it is the same thing.
That was going to be my next question. So I was going to say there are people that say DMT is this God molecule. And that's why when we take DMT, it's already in our body. And that's the molecule. Plants have DMT and everything has it's the one thing that we all are all of our bodies, all of our everything that's alive shares is the DMT molecule. So I just got chills.
Right.
I also have a reading after this and I know who it is. And I'm like, I can't tell what's what, but I'm feeling a lot of yes, yes, yes from spirit. That so people like us, from what I don't let me speak for you, but I believe that when I did mushrooms, for example, and it wasn't DMT, but in college, I thought I was hallucinating. Like I thought my brain is making all this up. Although I knew, I'm like, how could my brain be creating something so real? Because I'm watching these things come to life that I know are inanimate objects. I'm actually hearing this iguana cage breathing and watching it breathe. And now I see it as no, it just removed the veil and I can see all the possibilities of things that can be um, because we're not actually solid mass. And so I felt now I understand, at least in my belief, that it just basically shattered sort of the wall of the 3D. And there will be people that will say that have said to me, near death experiences, it's called DMT, it's a hallucination. It makes you feel like it's real, but it actually isn't. And I can see that why they feel that way, and I probably would have felt that way in the past. So what's the I want to so that was my question is like how is it different or like you said
Well,
it's actually not.
here's
It's the same.
one part on this is that
Yeah.
if you look at, evolutionary philosophies and, Darwinism and evolution of species and so forth, you know, this sometimes is a controversial statement, but really the only reason anything is alive to simply procreate. This is a system which feeds. It continues based on procreation. And everything evolves to be better at procreating, and anything else is irrelevant. You know what I mean? Like I evolved to be more attracted to mates. I evolved to live a little bit longer so that I'm more statistically capable of passing down my genetics. And over millions, thousands of years, these traits become predominant in species. And it's actually unique. Like you look at antlered, deer and elk. Antlers are actually really inconvenient. But because females are attracted to them, and so they mate with ones with horns, over time those horns get bigger, so like everything is a feedback system. And so if that's the case, then why have we evolved to have a release of DMT at the end of our lives? Why is it even relevant? Like it doesn't help me breathe, it doesn't help me do anything.
Right. Oh,
It is
that's
a
such a good point.
complete redundancy, but yet it happens. And so for people to say it's just DMT, it's just a hallucination, it's like, okay, fair. I can't argue that because this is a very subjective thing, but then why do we actually have it? If you're going to start going into the materialistic, rationalistic realm, then rationalize why we even have this release at the end of our life, because it doesn't serve any purpose with anything.
Right. And I
Like,
know,
it's,
yeah,
yeah,
I was going to say some people are like, it's just to help us calm down while we're dying so we're not in fear. But,
but why?
but, but why?
Why does that
Yeah,
help me do anything? Like, and if you're saying it helps me calm down because of fear, then now you're going into the intelligent design category. You're going into, like, why would anything give a shit about me being fearful when I die? Because it has nothing
there you
to do
go.
with procreation, unless something does. And again, I'm not talking about a bearded sky daddy,
Yeah,
watching me masturbate or something. I'm referring to,
right.
like, this collective consciousness and all these different things, because that's always my argument to that, is that if someone's going to start going into, rationalism, fine, but explain to me the purpose of this. Like birds, male birds having brightly colored feathers, that makes sense. That's an easy explanation. It's sexual selection. But this, it doesn't make any sense. And, another thing too that's interesting is, like, 5-MeO-DMT is also a very powerful psychedelic, which is also present in mammalian brains. DMT is present in everything, but 5-MeO-DMT has a tendency to be present in mammalian brains, which is quite fascinating. And I think the combination of these two things is a contributing factor to near-death experiences, plus our own endogenous hormones that are released. Like my phosphate was through the roof. I had all these weird electrolyte imbalances afterwards. And to me, it was very much a psychedelic experience. And now I've heard a lot of people start saying, well, DMT and machine elves and entities, it sounds terrifying. And it's like, fair, but that's not what this was. I've done NN-DMT in a very large amounts. And yes, there are intelligences that are giving you new information, and it is very profound and wild. But at the same time, like 5-MeO-DMT is, you're projecting deep into yourself, almost so far that you come out the other side as just sort of this infinite consciousness. And to me, that's more reminiscent of what this was. And and again, too, right? Like if you're synthesizing something or extracting it from plants, it's not the same as having it coming from my own body.
Yeah,
This is tailor made for my death. This is my go gracefully into the good night cocktail. So
yeah,
it's a little bit more nuanced than simply just saying it's a hallucination. Then fair
right.
enough.
Yeah, and I know that it's not even an argument. It's just sort of the one of the things that convinces me in my belief is that if it was a hallucination, why does everybody essentially have the same experience? Now, granted, all the details are different and the level to which they go over to quote unquote the other side differs. Yours was more of a feeling and a state of consciousness. Some people are
Yeah.
like, oh, there was my dad and there was my sister and there, all the people that had passed before me. And that doesn't always happen, but what is consistent is love is everything. I understand the
Yeah.
universe. I understand what I'm made of. I know where I come from. I'm finally home. And sometimes Jesus is there and sometimes Buddha is there and
Yeah.
sometimes it's just these beings of light or sometimes it's this all-knowing presence daddy in the sky kind of feeling what that feels masculine but may not be either that's sort of saying imparting to these people love yourself and love other people and that's it and you are worthy and all
Yeah.
that stuff. What were you going to say about that?
Well, I was gonna say, like, if you think about my experience, it was that omnipotent presence, androgyny. Like there was no gender to it. It was just simply raw consciousness, like an omnipotent, infinite complexity, so to speak. And and what I draw from this too, and also my psychedelic experiences, but specifically my death experience, is that we're all just facets of an infinite complexity experienced in itself subjectively. That's it. And
Right.
this doesn't have to be more or less, but it is. It's so deeply affiliated with just knowing thyself, in the sense of, like, there's an interesting thought process that if only one single thing existed, it wouldn't be anything because there's nothing to contrast it against. If there was just one thing, it would almost cancel itself out because there's nothing to compare it against, to give meaning, to give rise of experience. And so in this thought process, if everything is just a facet of an infinite complexity experience in itself, that is truly the only way to know oneself, is to just life, this experience. We move around, we talk, we have sex, we love, we're sad, we do horrible things, we do good things. It is literally knowing yourself more than you ever possibly could. It's like this massive stage being set. We're all just filtering consciousness through our biology and to whatever level that we have, and we're just experiencing.
Right.
And it took away a lot of the weight the expectations that we all have. What's the meaning of life, and how do I achieve this and that? And my experience just kind of made me very calm,
Yeah.
pleasantly calm, in the sense that it's okay,
It's
everything's okay.
yeah, one of my guests I just had on who's oh, she's just amazing. Betty, I had started to put up this sensational headline because I was like, I usually just put something basic for and I'm like, I know I have to kind of grab viewers. And then I wrote to her and was like, I want to be respectful of you. I don't want to sensationalize your story or exploit you in any way. She said, exploit away. That's how you have what you have to do to get the word out. And she said, I don't take anything personally. And I said, that's why I love near death experiencers, because for the most part, they don't let the little things, they just let everything roll off their back now. I mean, it's
Yeah,
and then Jason Janis I had on, and he was like, I messed up. I made a date with him and then totally forgot about it because I forgot to put it on the calendar or something. I don't know. And I was just doing my thing, and I was like, oh my God, I forgot I was out working, and I'm like, oh my God, I forgot. And he's like, it's no big deal. Who cares? And he's like, it's just
yeah.
time. It doesn't matter. And I'm like, see, that's what I love about that. What it brings, it brings that sense of calm and going with the flow. So I'm going to ask my next question by this is my disclaimer is that obviously I don't endorse or not endorse taking psychedelics. Um, I I say that if you are going to do it, please be sure that you've gotten mental health assess, mental that you know your mental health status, because I've known several people in my life who are bipolar that took drugs, psychedelic or otherwise, and ended up in psychosis and ended up dying or hospitalized and not really being the same after. So be careful with it. But I am very interested in it from a spiritual perspective, and I intend to at some point go on an ayahuasca retreat because I'm interested in the spiritual aspect of it. And so I would love it if you could share sort of what I know that every experience is different, right? But I'd love to know if you can share at least a little bit of one or some of your experiences. What was revealed to you? How was it revealed to you? And what did it feel like?
See, it's a very interesting question because if a picture says a thousand like words, a psychedelic experience is a million pictures. Like it's you know So we've evolved to see and understand things that are relevant to us, things that have helped us procreate, as we were talking about before. Like I understand what 10 stones looks like, but if you told me a million stones, it really breaks down in my comprehension of that. Or a billion, or 10 miles, fair enough. A million miles means nothing to me. A billion people means nothing to me. Like we have only evolved to understand what is present in the reality that we exist in, which is a very thin facet of reality if you think about all the different audio and light spectrums. But when you have a psychedelic experience, it is completely outside of our realm of what we perceive as reality. And how we experience it is beyond what we normally perceive in our sense of reality. And so having an explanation for it is very difficult, but I will endeavor to try.
Thank you.
So I remember the first time I did ayahuasca. You know, a friend of mine, he had come from Toronto to our house. It was me, my wife, and a couple other people. And I was lying there and I had taken it. And I remember it starting to build up and I could see these closed-eyed fractal patterns moving. And it was like it was starting to build and was pushing me into the floor. And then all of a sudden it just pushed. And it was almost like I went through the floor and then I was just in this experience. Like it was very difficult to defer what reality was compared to this. Like they had come the same thing. And it was like white noise and then it faded and I was like flying over this old Andean village and like I could feel the wind on my feathers and my vision was so detailed. I was looking down, I could smell the campfires, and I was literally just riding these air currents in the Andes mountains as this massive condor. And if it makes any sense to say I felt like I was thinking like a bird, it was weird. It was just everything was just such a unique and foreign experience. And then that faded into sort of this white noise again. And then all of a sudden I started feeling damp and I could hear insects. And I was in the Amazon rainforest and it was dark. And I sensed something very powerful nearby. And all of a sudden this huge anaconda started coiling around me and I was like struggling with it. And then finally I had the sensation that I just need to let go. And I just let go and it coiled around me and started squeezing. And I just was like, it's the end. And then it stopped and it was just staring at me. And all of a sudden it was like exchanging information and emotions back and forth. And it was almost like this whole idea that that is the purpose of all of this, is to simply just let go of everything. And not in the sense of go be a hermit in the bush and, pick mushrooms and whatever. But I mean, we hold on to so much. And by holding on to everything, it's almost like you can't see the tree because of the forest. You become incapable of stopping to smell the roses or to acknowledge moments. We're living in the past and the future. And it was just so blatantly clear to me. And, as this moment sort of subsided, it kind of I could see the eyes pulling back and then it was just hanging out in the corner of my mind. And I kind of came to and I'm looking around and like hours had passed and I was like, oh my God. And I felt incredible for like 3 weeks after that. Like I felt so rejuvenated. Like I had lost like 5 or 6, 10 pounds, 20 pounds. It was just the emotional state was wonderful. And I feel like that's a more tangible experience because it's relatable. I find that ayahuasca generally has that where you can experience some of it. But like 5-MeO-DMT, for instance, it's not illegal in Canada, which is fantastic.
Oh,
And so you can buy and order to your house.
did not
And
know that.
well, and it's one of the most powerful psychedelics known to man. Like
Yeah.
it's, 10 milligrams will dissolve your consciousness.
And
And so this isn't,
it's extracted from frogs. If anyone doesn't know what it is, but tell me what you know. Yeah.
well, technically the frog extraction is Cambo. And that's from a poison frog. And it's sort of like the venom that exists in the mucosal secretions on the skin. Whereas 5-MeO-DMT in one of its natural forms is from the Bufo alvarez toad and has these parotid venom glands, which already is unappetizing, but
Yeah.
you can milk them and then dry the secretions on glass and then scrape them and you can vaporize them. And then it's about 30% 5-MeO-DMT and then bufftonin and a whole series of other alkaloids. But you can get it since like synthetic, which is probably more environmental conscientiously sourced
Yeah.
as opposed to
Because they don't want to torture
taking
the
these.
frogs. Yeah.
Well, apparently they don't necessarily mind. I'm not a toad. Maybe that's just people
Yeah.
rationalizing. But at the end of the day, the problem is that people gather them all together and you spread disease because they don't normally are in contact with one another. And then you let them all go when you're done.
Oh,
And then whatever diseases now are communicable within this population. And that's kind of
yeah.
what they're
That's not
seeing as a big
nice.
issue. No. And so the synthetic I've done it many times. And it's it's basically losing your ego. And people talk about ego death. And I don't think people necessarily understand that because you've never not had an ego. And an ego is your identity. Like you're born and you're given a name and you start developing these experiences and you're conditioned by culture and by your parents to be programmed to behave in a certain way. And as you start accumulating these experiences, they shape the lens in which you view the world and you eventually turn into a teenager, hormones kick in, and you're using your operational software, which is your ego. And it's fundamentally designed to get you through life without dying. It's you get injured here and okay, we're gonna have some coping mechanisms to prevent this from again. You've been in a bad relationship and now you're guarding certain parts of you. And the ego fundamentally is your identity, it's your operating system. And 5-MeO-DMT sort of dissolves that. And again, it's that whole thing about letting go. You have to let go into this experience and you're basically committing suicide, from a lack of a better term. And when your ego dissolves, you just become everything. And
Yeah.
it was like being dead. And I don't think people realize how our biology influences our everyday mood. If I'm tired, sad, happy, horny, hungry, irritable, angry, all of these different hormonal things. I stubbed my toe, my back hurts, I have a headache, you
Yep.
know, all of these things, this weird meat suit that we exist in is influencing our day-to-day experience so
Hmm.
significantly. And also our ego, which is telling us all these crazy things that may be true, may not be true, or subjective or completely false. And it's overwhelming. You're just being bombarded with shit every second of every day. And then you go to sleep and now you're in another altered state of consciousness, which is a unique
Hmm.
state. And then when you have these experiences, it's like taking a break from being alive,
Yeah.
and you just go to this space of infinite love or just beautiful fractals. And you can really look at yourself objectively.
Right.
You know what I
And you,
mean? And be,
yeah,
yeah.
because you were just telling me that, your baby, your toddler was up and kept you up. And so then today you're going to be tired, and that's going to affect how you go through the world. As I shared, have a migraine at the moment. Don't worry, everyone. I'm on drugs, but I don't feel great. Um, but when I get a migraine, sometimes I'm euphoric beforehand, and I'll be like,
Yeah.
I'm in the best mood ever. And if I sleep too long or I don't sleep enough, if I don't get good sleep, and also I had gone off of my anti-anxiety meds a few months ago, thinking I'm actually good. I meditate, I do yoga, I'm very spiritual. I feel like I can ride the waves of life. Then I did a cross country move that was incredibly stressful. There were a lot of unknowns, a lot of change. I completely spiraled into poor mental health and could not uh, anxiety, depression, inability to cope, irritability. And that's why, as much as I wish I didn't have to do a drug because I would like to be in my normal state, look, if we lived in the jungle, I'd probably be fine. But we live in the society we live in, and there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of stress and environmental things happening and world events happening. It all affects the brain, the cortisol. I was adrenally exhausted. I could not function for like took months, and I finally said, "You know what? I'm going back on the drug." Now I'm like, "It's fine." My roommate just said, I have to move out." And I was like, I just moved in and now I can't afford the rent, but I was like, whatever. It's all meant to be. I was like, it's divine. It's actually a blessing. It's because there's something better. I really am not that invested. So sometimes you're right. It's all these chemicals, hormones, and all these things happening in our bodies. And unfortunately, some people check out of that by doing drugs, alcohol, um, whatever drugs. And I feel, and I would love to know how are I mean, psychedelics are still a drug, but I guess what I'm asking is, to me, I don't do drugs anymore. I don't even drink. CBD, THC, that's all I do. But at the end of the day, I feel like there is something about psychedelics that's different that helps us connect with our spiritual self and source. And I would like to know your sort of take on it because I'm interested to do it, not because I want to get high, and I know you aren't either, but because I want to know more about myself and my
Well,
place in the world.
and that's what it is. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people, like part of the reason I started my podcast was because we're seeing this psychedelic renaissance and all these people are just going with this recreational appetite for psychedelics. And I'm like, that's fine. But just because you want a recreational experience doesn't mean you're going to get one.
Yeah.
You might do a bunch of psychedelics and all of a sudden you're confronting suppressed memories from childhood. You're confronting this deeply, deeply guarded fear or anxiety or experience that has been buried inside you. And things that could potentially take like decades of therapy, you can confront in this single 6 7 hour experience and come to terms with. And again, it doesn't mean that you're fixed. We are full of circumstances such as this, but there's a reason why psilocybin and all these different psychedelics are being used to treat PTSD. They're being to treat, treatment resistant depression and anxiety and all these different things, because it makes you be honest with yourself. It makes you be vulnerable with yourself, which is an even more scary thing. There's something to be said that, like, if you're dating someone and they reject you, you can just move on. You know what I mean? You bear yourself and they reject you. Yeah, you're going to be a little bit hurt, but you can forget that ever happened. But if you're vulnerable to yourself, you got nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And it's a very difficult thing, this idea of being vulnerable with yourself and forgiving yourself. And people, I have nothing to forgive myself for. I'm like, oh, there is so much to forgive ourselves for. And so many experiences. Like it blows my mind. Like I don't think that I would be the person that I am today if I hadn't done this. Like I know that 10 years ago, like I was stressed and I just thought it was normal. I'm just like, humans are so, we have this wonderful capacity to acclimatize to things, good or bad. You people who live in California probably don't appreciate good weather as much as someone who lives in Northern Ontario. You know what I mean? Like it's,
Yeah.
coming out in the springtime and there's sun and you're pulling your clothes off just to get vitamin D. Like
Yes.
it's, you know what I mean? It's one of those unique things that we acclimatize to almost anything. And we can acclimatize to stress, we can acclimatize to these weights that we put on us, sometimes self-imposed, sometimes imposed by others. And to me, psychedelics is going in and dissolving these things and working through them, things that we don't necessarily want to. And it's not pleasant. It's not, a fun experience. And for me, like people like, oh, I don't want to have a bad trip. I'm like, well, then don't do psychedelics because invariably that's going to happen. You're
Right.
going to have something challenging come up inside. And it's funny you said that because like I don't really drink anymore either. I don't, you know, people have this idea like psychedelics are a drug, and it's like, well, so's caffeine, so's
Mm-hmm.
Prozac, so's everything.
Yep.
Like we exist in a in an environment where you have a whole bunch of drugs that are rubber stamped by society, and a whole bunch of other ones that are not.
Yeah. Like I had to do an a liquor training yesterday because I work in special events. And and I was just listening to these corporate trainings are like so ridiculous, but it was all about like well, technically like you are legally allowed to serve like a pregnant woman alcohol. You just have to like you like there are all these things where they're like because you can't that's her free will and like free right. I mean, it's her right to order a drink if she wants to order a drink. And I forget what the rule was around it, but there was a lot of talk about how to tell if someone's drunk, and it was like falling off a bar stool, inability to light their cigarette. And I was like, why is this like, first of all, why do we even need
From the
a
this sounds like it's from the
checklist?
70s
Yeah, I
first.
was
Yeah.
exactly. I was like, yeah, I mean, that's just low. Like, but I was thinking the fact that we even are, and he said, yeah, I mean, he's right. He's right. He's like, look, there's nothing wrong with drinking and there's nothing wrong with having a good time. And in my mind, I was like, well, I mean, not that there's morally and no, there's nothing morally wrong with it. But I was like, we just normalized this. And yet it took forever to get THC legalized, and it's still not legalized in so many places. In my mind, alcohol is one of the worst drugs you can take. It's a toxin.
It is.
It's
Well, it's a solvent among other things. And
there you go. And a
we've had a
depressant.
very it is. And we've had this weird tenuous relationship with alcohol for the last 10,000 years. And it's very much argued that the agricultural revolution was a lot less about baking bread than it was about brewing alcohol. Because brewing
Right.
alcohol can be done by simply making a mash and setting it outside, whereas baking bread is actually really difficult to create the ovens and all these different things. And it's more likely that alcohol was the impetus for people settling down and from hunter-gathering societies into these regimented cities, which expanded into our modern culture. But you're right, alcohol is a depressant. And if you really think about it, like if you took two groups of people and you were feeding one of them multiple ounces of alcohol a day, and the other ones were actually given, like, say, heroin, medical grade heroin on a daily basis. And you did that for like 20 years. The medical grade heroin, if they had clean, hygienic equipment to use it, would not really cause anything other than a very profound addiction. Whereas the alcohol would, well, cause at the very, the very
Cirrhosis
least,
of the liver.
liver issues, heart disease, encourage cancers, depression, a whole slew of issues. And I'm certainly not condoning heroin. I'm
No,
just saying that it's interesting how alcohol is so widely socially accepted as this thing that brings people together and it's harmonious and it's part of humanity, when it's like, no, it's actually profoundly damaging to one's physiology. And even now they're saying that any more than 2 drinks a week is probably going to increase chances of some cancers and heart disease. And then you look at psychedelics, and I have podcasts with people who are talking about creating analogs to combat dementia, Alzheimer's, to neurodegenerative conditions, because the old anecdotes that psilocybin makes your brain bleed has proved to be quite wrong. Actually, it reduces neuroinflammation, it increases neuroplasticity, it allows you to change the way in which you think. And 5-MeO-DMT is actually causes neurogeneration, so new brain cells being created in the hippocampal regions of your brain responsible for long-term memory formation. But that's
Yeah.
incredible. But
And
that
from
was thought to not be a thing quite recently.
yeah, and I don't you're way more eloquent about this, but from what I understand, because I want to ask about the role of psychedelics in healing trauma and how that works, but also from what I understand, it's sort of like if you take psilocybin, it sort of resets your brain back to it's like a reset. So that's but tell me what the role of that, how
Well,
that
there's an
works.
interesting, you know, sort of metaphor that people have where it's like, so you have a ski hill and you start going down like fresh powder and you create this indentation, and then more people come down and they're more apt to use that indentation because of the passive least resistance, and people will veer off in different directions, but fundamentally you create paths that are most commonly used. And that's the same way in how we think and how we respond to things. If I'm getting angry about simple stimuli, I'm more likely to go down this angry stimuli path because it's the most path is being used. And that a psychedelic experience is like like fresh snowfall again, where you can make new pathways that aren't detrimental, that are positive, perhaps, maybe like habits and things that you don't enjoy or that are bad for you, makes it easier to change. Like Michael
Right.
Pollan in How to Change Your Mind, that is the fundamental principle of that is a description of neuroplasticity.
Right. Neuroplasticity, that makes sense a
Hmm.
lot. What it really struck me is when you talked about your vision and that one uh experience that you had of the was it the condor or whatever the bird was, and then the snake, was it a
Yeah,
cope, yeah, um
anaconda.
anaconda. I was like, not a cobra, but I pictured it as a cobra. And the thing is, okay, if we talk about hallucinations versus real experience, I mean real spiritual experiences, what always strikes me about these is that if you were hallucinating, you'd be like, oh my God, I'm a bird and I'm being strangled by a snake. But the fact is, with that imagery or that experience, that because it feels real when it's happening to you, it comes all this revelation like, I need to let go. I need to, like it's not just
Yeah.
an image, it comes with the whole epiphany and these brainstorms and these symbolism, and dreams can do that too. And sometimes dreams are ridiculous and sometimes dreams have enormous symbolism, and it's always dreams have always fascinated me because I'm a very vivid dreamer, always have been, lucid dreamer almost my whole life. And the symbolism within it, when you go, let's break this down, it always makes perfect sense. And I've always been fascinated how does my brain, how is it so intelligent that even when I'm knocked out, it can create these stories, these linear stories that represent exactly the theme of what's happening in my life. Well, now I believe that that's because it's spiritual. It's not my brain just shooting off all this stuff. It actually means something. So, what do you think about that?
Well, I think about how much of what goes on in our brains that we just don't acknowledge. Like, simply walking, chewing a piece of gum, talking on a phone, and watching a bird flying, all of those activities combined would require like a supercomputer to make a robot maneuver with the same articulate, graceful gestures that we're capable of doing. Like, we are biological supercomputers. Yeah, I might not be able to do fractal math off the top of my head, but simply what we've developed to do over eons has been to climb a tree, to distinguish colors at a distance, to see motion. All of these things are incredible. If you really think about it, like how amazing in multitasking we are. And I've often had this idea that like when I'm conscious and I'm Adam and I'm moving around, I'm thinking about my day is almost like a tip of an iceberg of what we are. And underneath the water is this massive body of complexity that's just can't be involved in my day-to-day thoughts because it's so complex. And it's our spirit, so to speak, our essence, our all of these stored experiences that just revolve as energetic waves. And you know, it almost seems like we are given only what we're capable of using. And what I'm capable of using is just simply what I'm using right now, having a conversation. And it's very easy to get overwhelmed. Like we have learned how to filter immense amounts of information, but we're still receiving it to know to filter it. Like we input so much, like we are really supercomputers, but we only really think and talk about what I experience. But I'm like, but think of the amount of information that I'm simply just filtering out, all the ambient noise in the background, visual cues, fluttering, movement of leaves in my periphery. Like it's incredible amounts of information I'm just subconsciously filtering. Like
Yeah.
we are bombarded with incredible amounts of things and process it. Like we are literally supercomputers. So when you talk about dreaming and all these really unique, profound, visceral experiences, it's kind of the same with psychedelics. It's almost like this underwater body of ice has the capacity to interact with you. This tip of the iceberg that is sort of driving the car. And sometimes we need to talk into. Sometimes we're going off the rails. Sometimes we're just wrong about what we think and what we do. We wrap ourselves up so tightly with, there's an interesting idea that, right now in this, let's just say this moment of our existence as a species, we are being bombarded every day with massive amounts of information, social media, and a lot of it is very like disparaging information, one might say, or derisive. And we're taught from a young age by advertising companies that we're too fat, we're too ugly, our hair is too curly, it's too this, I'm too white, I'm too brown, I'm whatever. I need to buy something to validate myself. I need to buy something to fix what is wrong with me. And so, we grow up with this, and then you're bombarded with Ukraine war, there's a new pandemic, there's new this, that, interest rates are going up, housing costs are like every day you're being bombarded with massive amounts of information. And it's no wonder people are stressed out.
It's no wonder I'm on Prozac.
Yeah. You were
Yeah.
describing that, and you just had this move, and I'm like, I think most people, and I'm not a lot of people disagree with this, but I think most people are just sort of treading water or a little bit better.
Yeah.
And then you throw in a very significant life event, and all of a sudden your head starts going under a little bit. And people don't
Yeah.
understand why. It's like because you got used to treading water.
Right. And my
You know what I
sister was
mean?
saying the same thing today about there's just I said recently I just feel like there's all this there's all this like conflicts in my life. Like I'm having all these conflicts with people that I've never had before. And she said, well, part of it is that we're more in touch with everybody in our lives than ever before. We're more connected with everybody in some ways. I mean, I know that there is the argument of the opposite, but
Yeah.
like we have more access to each other, to one another. So we're constantly interacting, she said, on a daily basis, which makes it easier for us to like, and one of my best friends just reached out to me because I had posted a video of another friend of mine who is going through religious trauma therapy. I mean, she was raised evangelical in there's a church that there was just a documentary made about, and it's basically a cult, but she was raised within this. And so she's done a whole TikTok series on just how messed up it all was. And there was really no context when I shared it because what she was saying is it divided me from other people. It told me that I was the only right one and that everybody else was going to hell. And especially my atheist friends, everybody was going to hell. And she's like, and because of that, I feared these other people, and it broke. And so I really that resonated. So I posted it, and then one of my best friends is Christian, and she was like that. I'm very upset by this, and we weren't in a fight. She was very cool about it, but she was like, you don't have to take it down. I said, no, I'm taking it down because I don't want people to think that I'm anti-Christian because I'm not. But but I was saying it's just like all this access where it's like now my opinion's out there and now it's affecting somebody that I care about. Now she's upset and triggered, and then we have to have a whole conversation about it. Whereas if social media didn't exist, that would never come up. Or if we weren't in contact every single day, we wouldn't have so many opportunities to have conflict about things. So it's like the great connector and the great divider.
Well, and it is because, one could argue that we are more connected than we ever have been before. But at the same time, we're more alienated in the absence of community than we ever have been before. Like we are a primate species that is designed to be in physical contact with one another. There are a
Yes.
variety of different things, like hugging, smells, olfactory responses, and the vast majority of everything occurs in text and meme and these short little stories. And you can't tell me that someone's Instagram feed or their Facebook is an accurate representation of their life.
Right.
It gives people a platform to perpetuate these ideas of what they want to be, of all the things, how they want to be perceived, but yet you just create this wall around you of, I don't want to say lies, but at the very least of exaggerated self-grandization.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because and I'm not saying this applies to everyone, but the vast majority of people aren't going to put their inadequacies on Facebook. They don't have to put their inadequacies on social media. We want to project that we're doing okay. We want to project that this avocado toast is the best in the world and this trip I'm on is the best thing. And then it makes everyone else feel like I'm not doing something right. And then they overcompensate. And we're just creating this bizarre alternate reality within social media. And we are more alienated. We don't exist with one another the same way we used to.
Compare and despair.
Yeah. And you're talking about that evangelical thing about, divide and conquer and disparaging. It's like, well, we live in an environment now where there's no recourse to saying really terrible things to one another.
Mhm. Yeah.
And and simple
Hmm.
things can get you canceled, and people take everything as these deep, deep offenses. And it's like every time we do that, we're just moving away from any form of unity and community. And not, don't get me wrong, you know, I feel in today's polarizing political environment, people have gone to the respective side, barricaded themselves in, or just throwing rocks over the barricades.
Mm.
And I don't know if that's just part of the pendulum swing, and we're going to start coming back down again the other direction because everything seems to be cyclical. But it is worthwhile noting that in a time of global trade and commerce and communication, we've probably never been so alienated.
Yeah. And as we wrap up here, I would just love to know, um, why do you think that we're here as humans on this earth?
I find it that like there's like the biological imperative to reproduce, you know, and to assist in the reproductive process, as tribal groups. And then there's the spiritual aspect of things that I think we're simply here just to experience and for this infinite complexity to simply know itself. We're here to love one another. We're here to interact. We're here to create relationships and screw up and learn from our mistakes and grow as an energy, to grow as an entity, to grow as a single unified whole, if you want to say that. And I feel like people always want to attribute deep meaning to everything, and I think my experiences with death and with all these other experiences lead me to believe that it's a lot simpler than that. The purpose
Yeah.
of existence is to simply experience. And I think that there is an underlying trend of just love, and love yourself so that you can truly love someone else. And loving someone else technically is loving yourself if you look at it from this perspective of unity. We're
That's beautiful.
just, well, and another thing too is like, we just need to walk each other home.
Hmm.
We just need to find patience with one another and patience with ourselves. I've said this very frequently to people, is that the vast majority of us would never tolerate being in a relationship with someone who talks to us the way that we talk to ourselves.
Absolutely.
Oh my God, we are our own worst critic. You know what I mean? And
The
we are
worst.
also the authors of our discontent. Like I say to a lot of people, just be fucking gentle with yourself.
Yeah.
We are all works in progresses. We're all trying. And you know what? Can't be cool all the time. Just take a breath, relax. And, I've always thought this is that you can never truly love someone else unless you love yourself. And that's a very easy thing to say, but very difficult in practice. And I've been working on that for quite some time. And it's amazing, you know,
Yeah.
our
Well,
own internalized struggle.
I love listening to you speak about all of this, and I could talk with you for 20 more hours. Thank you so much for joining me and for sharing your insight, your wisdom, your experience with me and my viewers. And I'm going to have links below to your podcast. To your
Mm.
podcast, is there anything else you want to share for offerings or things that where people can
Well,
find you?
I'm a majority shareholder of an fMRI software company. What we're doing, basically, you go into an fMRI and it can create an individualistic neural thumbprint for your neural connectivity specifically. And then using that, we can create baselines to diagnose things like tinnitus, traumatic brain injuries, PTSD. And so we're starting to move that around, working with law firms and private psychedelic companies for research, and Saudi Arabia, Europe. And it's called BrainNet. It's actually really cool software. If someone was interested in such a thing, feel free to
Yeah.
check it out. And a lot of people are actually getting private scans and then having that information ran through the software so that they have one of the most complete neurological assessments you can get of connectivity. And then 5 years later, people try lion's mane or psychedelics, and then you have another one a couple years later or something, and you can have these comparisons from monitoring aging processes or any number of things. It's really quite fascinating.
That is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you again, Adam Tapp, for being here. You are awesome. And I look forward to seeing more of you and to see what happens next.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you, Shannon.
You too.